Hi, I'm Sam. I once watched a 4-star admiral look my 11-year-old brother in the eye and tell him to get out of his sight, calling him a useless distraction. This was on the bridge of the U.S. Vigilance, a battleship that had gone completely dead in hostile waters. What that admiral didn't know was that the lives of all 1,500 souls on that ship, including his own, depended entirely on what my little brother Leo was about to do. It's funny how the people with the most power are sometimes the blindest. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the key to solving a huge problem? Before I tell you how Leo used nothing but his bare hands to restart that dead engine, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see the look on that admiral's face when he heard the turbines roar back to life. The Vigilance wasn't just quiet, it was a tomb. A massive, floating steel coffin waiting for a torpedo. We were adrift in a disputed strait, the kind of place where things go from tense to tragic in a heartbeat. The air was thick and suffocating, a foul mix of cold sea salt, hot metal, and the smell of burnt diesel that clung to the back of your throat. A catastrophic engine failure had silenced the heart of the ship, leaving us vulnerable under a sky that felt like it was pressing down on us. Leo and I were only there because of a family emergency back home. Our grandfather, the ship's chief engineer, had arranged for us to travel with him on what was supposed to be a routine patrol. Now, my little brother was just a ghost, a small shadow slipping through corridors as sailors ran past with panic in their eyes. The real weight of the situation hit me in the engine room. It was a cavern of useless steel, filled with the shouts of frustrated men. I saw Admiral Hayes, a man who looked like he was carved from granite, tearing into our grandfather. His voice was a low growl, each word a hammer blow of blame and impatience. "Get it working, Marcus, or so help me God, this will be your last voyage." And there was my grandfather, a man I'd always seen as a titan, looking small and defeated, his face pale under the harsh emergency lights. Leo stood silently in a corner, half hidden behind a pillar, watching the whole thing. I could feel his heart breaking from across the room. He wasn't just watching his hero fail, he was watching him be publicly humiliated by a man who had already given up. Leo was never like other kids. He didn't play with toys, he listened to machines. Our grandfather Marcus had practically raised him on the stories of this old ship. He didn't learn about engines from manuals or computer screens. He learned by tracing his fingers over the original, hand-drawn World War II blueprints that Gramps kept locked away. He listened to old audio logs of the engine room, memorizing every hum, click, and groan until he knew the ship's rhythm by heart. It was more than knowledge. It was an instinct. He could feel when something was wrong, like a musician hearing a single note out of tune in a whole orchestra. But in that world of polished brass and rigid hierarchy, what good was that? To Admiral Hayes and his desperate crew, he was just a boy. A fantasy. A distraction in a crisis that had no room for imagination. I saw the exact moment our grandfather broke. He was staring at a diagnostic panel, his face a mask of utter despair, when he noticed Leo. My brother had crept closer to the main turbine housing, his hand outstretched, not as if to touch it, but as if he were trying to feel something in the air. The Admiral was breathing down Gramps' neck. The pressure was suffocating. For a second, I thought Gramps saw the look in Leo's eyes, that intense, unnerving focus. But the moment passed. The weight of his duty, of the Admiral's glare, was too much. "Leo, get back!" "Now," he snapped, his voice sharp with a pain that had nothing to do with the engine. "Stay out of the way. Let the men work." The words hit Leo harder than a physical blow. He just nodded, his face blank, and retreated into the shadows, rejected by the one person he thought would always understand. The problem wasn't just that the engine stopped. It had died violently. There was a shudder that ran through the entire hull, a deep, gut-wrenching groan, and then nothing. The main steam turbine, the very soul of the Vigilance, went silent, plunging us into the dim, humming world of emergency power. The engineers, even the civilian specialists they patched in via a crackling satellite link, were stumped. They later found out the issue was a series of tiny, microscopic fractures in a coolant regulator valve, a flaw so small and ancient it wasn't on any modern schematic. They were searching for a massive electronic failure, a blown circuit or a broken gear, But the real problem was hidden deep in the ship's old bones. The experts had officially given up. Their final report was grim. The engine was irreparable at sea. We were stranded, a crew of 1,500 men waiting for a miracle or an enemy missile. The silence from Leo was worse than any crying could have been. He just folded into himself, becoming smaller, as if trying to take up less space in a world that had just told him he was worthless. His shoulders, usually so straight when he talked about engines, slumped forward. He found a dark corner behind a large ventilation duct and sat down, his back against the cold steel wall. He wasn't pouting. It was something deeper, a retreat into a place I couldn't reach. I watched him from across the chaotic engine room, and it felt like a light had gone out inside him. The injustice wasn't just that they didn't believe him. It was that his own grandfather, his hero, had been the one to push him away. The man who had taught him to listen to the ship's soul had just told him to be quiet. Meanwhile, the official efforts grew more desperate and theatrical. The engineers, their faces slick with sweat, started pulling at panels and rerouting auxiliary power with a kind of brute force that screamed panic. They weren't diagnosing anymore. They were just trying things, anything, hoping for a spark of life. I heard one of them mutter to another, "Let's try a hard reset on the primary coolant pumps. Might blow a few fuses, but what have we got to lose?" The Admiral stood over them, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. Every failed attempt was met with a deeper, more menacing silence from him. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone from shorted circuits and the metallic tang of pure fear. They were like surgeons trying to perform heart surgery with a sledgehammer, making more of a mess with every swing. I couldn't stand it. I walked over to Leo's corner, my own heart pounding with a useless anger. "Leo, are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't even look up. He just stared at the floor grates, his eyes unfocused. It was like he wasn't even there. He was so still, so completely removed from the chaos around us, that for a second I was scared. It wasn't the stillness of a calm child. It was the stillness of something that had broken. He was surrounded by the very machines he loved, the ones he understood better than anyone, and he was being forced to watch them die while being treated like a piece of furniture. The humiliation was a physical presence in that corner, a cold shroud that I could feel but couldn't get through. That's when I noticed it. His head was tilted ever so slightly, his ear aimed toward a massive conduit pipe that ran along the wall. In the midst of the shouting, the clanging of tools, and the low hum of the emergency generators, he was listening to something else. Something no one else could hear. I leaned in closer, trying to catch what he was focused on, but all I heard was the same wall of noise. For him, though, it was different. I could see a flicker of concentration in his eyes, a subtle frown forming on his face. It was a look I'd seen before, back in our grandfather's workshop, when he'd be trying to figure out the source of a tiny rattle in an old clock. He wasn't just hiding in the corner, he was hunting. He was tracking a sound that was lost to everyone else. The tension finally snapped. Admiral Hayes turned from the useless diagnostic screens and grabbed the ship-wide intercom microphone. His voice boomed through the corridors, cold and final. "This is the Admiral. The engineering department has been unable to restore main power. We have 6 hours. If the engines are not operational by 0400, I will be forced to transmit a distress signal, broadcasting our position to all vessels in this strait, friendly and hostile. Out." The click of the microphone echoed in the sudden, dead silence of the engine room. 6 hours. He had just put a timer on our lives. The faces of the sailors around me went pale. Now it wasn't just a failure. It was a countdown to becoming a sitting duck in the most dangerous waters on the planet. That announcement seemed to shake our grandfather out of his stupor. The weight of the Admiral's words landed on him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. His gaze swept across the room, past the defeated faces of his crew, and landed on us. On me, and then on Leo, still sitting in his corner. I saw something shift in Gramps' expression. It was a flicker of memory, a ghost of a thought. I knew he was remembering that time last winter when our old furnace gave out. The repairman had quoted us thousands for a new unit, said the old one was shot, but Leo had spent an hour just listening to it, and then, with a simple pair of pliers, tightened a single loose bolt on the thermostat relay, and it had roared back to life. A problem no expert could find. Driven by a force I couldn't understand, Leo finally stood up, He didn't look at me, or our grandfather, or the Admiral. He looked at the wall of pipes and machinery as if it were a map. The faint, high-pitched hum that only he could hear was his guide. He started walking, his steps slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had filled the room moments before. He moved past the main control console, ignoring the blinking red lights and the screens full of error codes. He was heading for a part of the engine room that was dark and grimy, an area full of auxiliary systems that everyone had dismissed as irrelevant. I held my breath, watching him go. Every person in that room had given up. But Leo, the invisible boy in the corner, was just getting started. He walked right past a team of engineers who were staring blankly at a schematic on a tablet, their faces pale and defeated. They didn't even seem to see him. It was as if this small boy, moving with such quiet purpose, was on a different plane of existence. The only person who seemed truly aware of him was Admiral Hayes, whose eyes narrowed, tracking Leo's every step with a look of cold, sharp disbelief. I could almost hear his thoughts. What is this nonsense? In my engine room? But he didn't say a word, not yet. He was letting the scene play out, perhaps out of a morbid curiosity, or because he too was out of options. The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the low thrum of the emergency generators, and the soft scuff of my brother's shoes on the steel deck plating. Leo stopped in front of a section of the wall that was a chaotic mess of thick, greasy pipes and old, rusted junction boxes. It was a forgotten corner of the engine room, a place where maintenance logs likely hadn't been updated since the Cold War. No blinking lights, no digital readouts, just old-fashioned steel and bolts. He completely ignored a massive, modern diagnostic port that the civilian experts had been trying to access remotely for hours. Instead, his attention was fixed on a massive, curved conduit pipe, slick with decades of condensation and grime. It vibrated, with a low, almost imperceptible frequency, the source of the sound that had called to him. He was a doctor who had ignored the patient's chart and was now listening directly to their heartbeat, searching for the arrhythmia no one else could detect. Just as Leo reached out a hand, a young lieutenant, eager to show initiative, stepped forward and blocked his path. "Hey kid, get back from there." "That's live conduit," he said, his voice trying to be authoritative, but laced with the same frayed nerve tension as everyone else's. "This isn't a playground." He grabbed Leo's arm, not roughly but firmly enough to stop him. For a moment, it felt like the spell was broken, that the fragile bubble of concentration around my brother would pop and he'd just be a little boy again, scared and lost. The Admiral watched, impassive, a silent approval of the lieutenant's by-the-book intervention. It was the logical thing to do, the correct procedure. But something in my gut screamed that it was the worst possible move. That's when our grandfather moved. He crossed the deck in 3 long strides and put a hand on the lieutenant's shoulder. "Let him go," Gramps said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension with the authority of his 50 years of service. The lieutenant turned, surprised, his mouth open to protest. "Sir, with all due respect, he's a civilian child." But my grandfather just shook his head, his eyes locked on the officer. I said, "Let him be, now." It was a direct countermand, a chief engineer defying protocol, right in front of the Admiral. The lieutenant, caught between 2 powerful authorities, slowly let go of Leo's arm. It was a monumental gamble. My grandfather had just staked his entire career, his reputation, and his pension on whatever my 11-year-old brother was about to do. Free again, Leo didn't even seem to notice the drama that had just unfolded for his sake. His focus was absolute. He placed both of his small hands flat against the cold, vibrating surface of the massive pipe. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. All around him was the pinnacle of naval engineering, millions of dollars of diagnostic equipment, and a room full of the Navy's best minds, all of them useless. And here was this kid, using nothing but his sense of touch, trying to commune with a machine the size of a building. The sailors and engineers stood frozen, watching this bizarre, silent ritual. The arrogance and panic had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, almost fearful curiosity. What on earth was he doing? His hands began to move, sliding slowly along the greasy surface of the pipe, his fingertips tracing a path I couldn't see. He was like a tracker following faint footprints in the snow, except his trail was a subtle change in vibration. He followed the conduit down, away from the main turbine assembly, toward an even darker, more neglected corner of the room. He knelt, his small frame almost disappearing behind a tangle of smaller feeder lines. His hand stopped at a small, rectangular metal plate bolted to the wall. It was no bigger than a shoebox, covered in so much grime that I could barely make out the faded, stenciled letters. Manual pressure equalizer, obsolete. It was a piece of the ship's history, a relic from a time before computers, something everyone had assumed was long since disconnected. The Admiral's patience finally snapped. The quiet spectacle had gone on long enough. "Thorn," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This is a circus. We have less than 5 hours. Get your grandson out of my engine room, now." The command was absolute, the final word. The brief, fragile hope that had flickered in the room was about to be extinguished. The lieutenant who had tried to stop Leo earlier looked vindicated. Our grandfather didn't move. He just stood there, a statue of defiance, his eyes fixed on Leo's back. He looked at the Admiral, then back at his grandson, his face a mask of desperate, irrational faith. The entire ship, all 1,500 lives, felt like they were balanced on the head of a pin, and the only person who could see it was a boy about to be dragged away. But just as the Admiral's words hung in the air, a final verdict delivered, my grandfather did something I will never forget. He didn't argue, he didn't plead. He simply turned his back on the Admiral, a gesture of such profound insubordination that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He walked over and stood between Leo and the rest of the world, a living shield of defiance. He knelt down, the sound of his old knees cracking on the steel deck, a small, human sound in the vast, silent machine. He looked my brother in the eye, ignoring the furious Admiral just feet away. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. Show me what you hear." It wasn't a request, it was an abdication. He was handing over the reins, placing his faith, his career, and our lives into the hands of a child. The Admiral was momentarily stunned into inaction, his face a mask of pure disbelief at this blatant challenge to his authority. He looked like a man who had been slapped in public. Before he could recover, Leo, who seemed to be in a world of his own, responded to our grandfather's voice. He didn't speak, but he raised a small, trembling hand and pointed a greasy finger directly at the obsolete plate on the wall. He then looked up at Gramps, his eyes wide and full of a desperate, urgent need to be understood. The Admiral finally found his voice. "Thorn," he roared, taking a menacing step forward. "I am giving you a direct, lawful order. Remove that child from my engine room, or I will have you and him confined to the brig under guard." The threat was no longer implied. The armed sailors at the hatch shifted, their rifles held a little tighter. My grandfather didn't even flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Leo, completely shutting out the Admiral's rage. "What is it, Leo? What's behind that plate?" he asked, his voice a low, steady murmur that was just for the two of them. It was a sacred space they had created in the middle of chaos. Leo leaned in closer to the plate, his small finger tracing its grimy outline. "It's stuck," he whispered, the words so quiet I could barely hear them. "It's humming wrong. It's supposed to asterisk click when it moves a clean sound. But it's just buzzing. A hot, angry buzz." It was the language of a child trying to describe a complex mechanical failure. But for my grandfather, who had spent a lifetime listening to this ship, those words were more precise than any diagnostic report. He knew exactly what Leo meant. That was the final straw for Admiral Hayes. His face was a thundercloud of fury. "Guards!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "Escort Chief Thorn and the boy to the brig. That is a direct order. Move!" The two armed sailors at the entrance immediately snapped to attention and started walking towards us, their heavy boots clanging on the steel deck with a grim finality. This was it. It was over. The small, flickering ember of hope was about to be stamped out by military protocol. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to scream, to run, to throw myself in front of them, but my feet were bolted to the floor. I was just a spectator to my family's disgrace, to our collective doom. The sailors were just a few feet away, their faces set and impassive. Then, the impossible happened. The young lieutenant, the same one who had first grabbed Leo's arm, stepped forward, placing himself directly in the path of the armed guards. He held up a hand, a gesture that took more courage than I'd ever seen. "Sir, Admiral, wait," he stammered, his voice shaking but resolute. The Admiral rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "Lieutenant, are you countermanding my order?" The lieutenant swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tight, but he held his ground. "Sir, with all due respect, I think the chief is right. I recognize that housing. That's the manual equalization feed for the primary coolant regulator. It's a pre-digital system. It's not on any modern schematic. We all assumed it was decommissioned decades ago." He had connected the dots. The obsolete junk was suddenly the key. A strange silence fell over the engine room. The lieutenant's words had pierced the Admiral's armor of rage, planting a single, powerful seed of doubt. He stared at the lieutenant, then at my grandfather kneeling on the grimy deck, and finally at the small, insignificant metal plate. You could see the war on his face. The rigid certainty of his command was now battling against the minuscule, absurd possibility that this boy, this circus, was actually right. His pride was fighting against the cold, hard fact that his ship was dead and his experts had failed. "You have 60 seconds, Thorn," the Admiral finally bit out, his voice a low, dangerous growl that promised severe consequences. 60 seconds to prove this isn't the most colossal waste of time in my career. After that, you're both in irons." My grandfather didn't need to be told twice. He didn't even acknowledge the Admiral. He grabbed a heavy spanner from the loop on his belt and immediately set to work on the rusted, ancient bolts that held the panel in place. They were seized solid, frozen by decades of neglect, humidity, and grime. He threw all his weight into it, his face contorting with effort, his knuckles turning white as he strained against the unmoving metal. The only sound in the vast, silent room was the tortured groan of the wrench, and my grandfather's ragged breathing. Every single person, from the lowest-ranking seaman to the Admiral himself, was frozen, their eyes glued to that single small plate. Leo stood beside him, his hand resting on Gramps' shoulder. The first bolt finally gave way with a loud, sharp crack that echoed like a rifle shot. The 60-second countdown felt like an eternity and a half-second all at once. My grandfather worked with a frantic, desperate energy, his knuckles bleeding as he wrenched at the final, stubborn bolt. The only sounds in the world were his ragged breaths and the high-pitched squeal of metal grinding against metal. The Admiral stood like a statue of judgment, his eyes fixed on the stopwatch on his wrist, his expression unreadable. I could feel the collective breath of every person in that room being held, a fragile bubble of tension that was about to burst. With a final, guttural grunt and a loud crack that echoed through the silence, the last bolt gave way. The heavy steel plate sagged, and Gramps pulled it free, tossing it onto the deck with a loud clang that made everyone jump. He didn't waste a second. He shone his flashlight into the dark, cramped space behind the plate. It was a chaotic nest of thick, rubber-coated wires, small copper pipes, and forgotten mechanisms, all layered with decades of grime and dust. It looked like the guts of an ancient radio. "What am I looking for, Leo?" he asked, his voice strained. But Leo didn't answer with words. He pushed past our grandfather, his small frame allowing him to get closer. He reached his thin arm deep into the opening, his fingers disappearing into the mechanical mess. He wasn't looking. His eyes were closed again. He was feeling his way through the metallic labyrinth, his touch his only guide. The Admiral took a step forward, his mouth opening to declare the time was up. This was it, the final moment of failure. "That's it," Leo whispered, his voice slightly muffled from inside the wall cavity. "It's hot." Before anyone could react, he grunted with a small effort, a sound of focused exertion. Then he pulled his arm back out. He hadn't removed anything. His hand was empty, except for a fresh smear of black grease. "I pushed it," he said simply, looking up at our grandfather. The Admiral let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "He pushed it? Thorn, this is beyond absurd. Guards, take them." But he was cut off by the lieutenant, who had scrambled over with a flashlight of his own. He aimed the beam into the hole, his eyes wide. "Sir, he's right. The equalization pin. It's seated. I can see it. It must have been seized by the thermal expansion from the initial shutdown." The technical jargon hung in the air, a shocking validation of a child's touch. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause. The lieutenant's words, so full of technical certainty, clashed violently with the absurdity of the situation. An entire battleship, a billion-dollar piece of military hardware, brought to its knees by a single tiny pin that had gotten stuck, and fixed by a boy who just pushed it? The engineers stared, their mouths agape, their complex theories and diagnostic charts rendered utterly useless. The Admiral stood frozen, his command to the guards dying on his lips. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, fury, disbelief, and the dawning, horrifying possibility that he was wrong. 10 seconds passed. 20. The only sound was the low, mocking hum of the emergency generators. My hope, which had soared so high, began to plummet. It hadn't worked. And then I heard it. A single, quiet metallic click. It was a tiny sound, almost imperceptible, but in the dead silence of the engine room, it was as loud as a cannon shot. It came from deep within the heart of the main turbine assembly. A second later, a low, whirring sound started, the sound of a pump engaging. It grew steadily, joined by another, and then another. The dim emergency lights flickered violently, and then were suddenly extinguished, replaced by the brilliant, unwavering white light of the ship's main power grid. The rows of dead computer monitors and diagnostic screens on the main console flickered to life, one after another, their status indicators all blinking a steady, healthy green. The air itself felt different, alive, humming with a power that had been absent for what felt like a lifetime. The low hum rapidly swelled into a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the steel deck, up through my legs and into my chest. It was the sound of the main steam turbines spooling up, the sound of the ship's heart beating once more. It was a glorious, deafening symphony of power, a sound that drowned out all fear and doubt. It was the sound of survival. Around the room, the stunned silence of the sailors broke, and they erupted into a spontaneous, ragged cheer. It wasn't a cheer of victory, but of pure, unadulterated relief. Men were clapping each other on the back, some were laughing, and I saw one hardened engineer wipe a tear from his eye. They weren't just sailors on a ship anymore. They were a crew that had been pulled back from the brink. Through it all, I watched the Admiral. He hadn't moved. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a shock so profound it looked almost painful. His gaze flickered from the green-lit monitors confirming full operational status to the roaring turbine, and then, finally, it settled on my brother. Leo was just standing there, next to our grandfather, looking small and slightly overwhelmed by the noise. He had a smudge of grease across his cheek, and his hands were filthy, but his eyes were clear. The Admiral stared at him, not with anger or disbelief anymore, but with a look of raw, uncomprehending awe. The 4-star Admiral, the commander of this floating fortress, had just witnessed a miracle, and the miracle worker was an 11-year-old boy he had dismissed as a useless distraction. The Admiral didn't move for a long time. He just stood there, a statue carved from disbelief, as the engine room roared around him with the glorious sound of life. The sailors were cheering, a raw, ragged explosion of pure relief, but Hayes seemed oblivious to it all. His eyes were locked on my brother. Slowly, deliberately, he began to walk. The crowd of celebrating men parted for him like the Red Sea, falling silent as he passed. He walked right past our grandfather and stopped directly in front of Leo. He was a mountain of a man, his shadow completely engulfing my small brother. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to unleash all his fury, that his pride would win out. The silence in the room was now more terrifying than the noise had been. He just stared down at Leo, and in his eyes I saw the entire war he was fighting with himself. The rigid commander, the man of protocol and power, was crumbling before the undeniable, impossible truth. He looked at Leo's greasy hands, at the smudge on his cheek, and then back into his clear, steady eyes. Then he did something that I know no one on that ship will ever forget as long as they live. Admiral Hayes, a man who commanded fleets and held the lives of thousands in his hands, slowly brought his hand up to his brow. He executed a perfect, formal, textbook salute. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with a weight that felt heavier than the ship itself. He held it there, honoring this small, silent boy in front of his entire crew. In that single, silent gesture, The hierarchy of the entire U.S. Navy was turned upside down. As the Admiral lowered his arm, my grandfather finally moved. The tension broke, and he let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He lunged forward and wrapped his arms around Leo, pulling him into an embrace so tight I thought my brother might pop. He buried his face in Leo's hair, and I could see his broad shoulders shaking. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. It was all there. The pride, the terror he'd felt, the shame for ever doubting him, the overwhelming love. It was the most honest and raw thing I'd ever seen my grandfather do. Leo, for his part, just hugged him back, his small arms barely reaching around Gramps' waist, his face pressed into the rough fabric of the old man's coveralls. He was finally home, safe in the arms of the man who had taught him the ship's language in the first place. Word spread through the Vigilance faster than a fire drill. By the next morning, Leo was no longer an invisible ghost. He was a legend. The sailors started calling him the Engine Whisperer. They would nod at him in the corridors, their faces full of a kind of shy awe. The engineers who had scoffed at him now sought him out, asking quiet, respectful questions about what he'd heard, what he'd felt. They treated him not as a child, but as a colleague, a specialist with a sense they couldn't comprehend. Someone left a bar of chocolate on his bunk. Another sailor pressed a worn copy of an old naval engineering manual into his hands. He was no longer a distraction or a piece of luggage. He had become a part of the ship's soul, as real and vital as the engine he had saved. A few days later, when things had settled down, the Admiral called for a small gathering in the engine room. It wasn't a formal ceremony, just the engineering crew, Gramps, Leo, and me. Admiral Hayes stood before my brother and held out a small, custom-made patch. It was a perfect replica of our grandfather's chief engineer insignia, but underneath, in gold thread, it read, Junior Chief. He pinned it himself onto Leo's shirt. From this day forward, the Admiral announced, his voice clear and steady, you have unrestricted access to any part of this engine room. Your observations are not only welcome, they are encouraged. He wasn't just giving a gift, he was changing the rules. He was acknowledging that true expertise didn't always come with a rank or a diploma. Sometimes it came with a gift for listening. That event changed more than just our lives. It changed the ship. It became a story the old hands told the new recruits, a lesson passed down in the steel belly of Vigilance. They learned that day that the most powerful systems aren't always the most complex, and that sometimes the key to a massive problem is a small, simple truth that everyone else is too proud or too busy to see. My brother never became arrogant or loud, he just kept listening. He'd spend his days with Gramps, his new patch on his chest, his hands dirty, his ears tuned to the hums and clicks of the ship. He found his place. And we all learned that the greatest strength isn't in giving orders, but in having the wisdom to recognize when it's time to be quiet and let the real expert do their work, no matter how small they are. That day on the Vigilance wasn't just a single event. It was the moment my brother's entire life clicked into place. He wears that Junior Chief patch on his work coat to this day, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The fame on the ship faded into a quiet, deep-seated respect, which suited him far better. He never became loud or boastful. The experience didn't give him an ego. It gave him a quiet certainty in who he was. He found his validation not in the Admiral's salute, but in the steady, powerful roar of the engine he had healed. He learned that his strange gift wasn't a flaw or a fantasy, but a language, and he spent the rest of his life becoming more and more fluent in it, always listening to the things no one else could hear, trusting his hands over any manual. For our grandfather, it was a moment of profound redemption. The shame he felt for dismissing Leo was washed away by an overwhelming wave of pride. He had spent his life trusting protocol, trusting the chain of command, and in one terrifying moment, he chose to trust his grandson instead. That choice freed him. After that day, he started teaching Leo not as a child, but as an equal, a true apprentice. He'd hand over the old blueprints, not for Leo to memorize, but to add his own notes to. He saw that his legacy wasn't just in maintaining the ship, but in passing the torch to the one person who understood its soul even better than he did. Their bond, which had been strained by the crisis, was reforged into something unbreakable, built on a shared secret and a deep mutual respect. The story of the Engine Whisperer became a permanent part of the ship's culture. Admiral Hayes, I was told, was never quite the same. He became a leader known for his willingness to listen, for walking the lower decks and asking the youngest sailors for their thoughts. He learned that day that authority and wisdom are not the same thing. The legend served as a constant reminder to every person on that ship. Arrogance is a blindfold. It taught them to look for answers in the most unlikely places, and to respect the quiet knowledge that doesn't come with a rank. The USC Vigilance became more than just a battleship. It became a place where a single millimeter-sized pin taught a crew of 1,500 men a lesson in humility that no academy could ever offer. Looking back, what I saw that day was more than just a boy fixing a machine. I saw a timeless battle play out in the heart of that engine room, the clash between rigid systems and human intuition. We build these massive, complex structures, these hierarchies and protocols, and we put so much faith in them that we forget to listen. We trust the diagnostic screens over the evidence of our own senses. We value the person with the most stripes on their shoulder over the one with the most understanding in their heart. Leo didn't defeat a machine. He reminded a room full of powerful men that sometimes the most complex problems don't require a more complex solution. They just require a different way of listening and the courage to trust what you hear. If you know someone who has ever been made to feel small, who has a talent that the world doesn't have a label for yet, please share this story with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that our unique gifts have value, even if no one else can see it yet. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own strength in a world that often demands we follow a script. Thank you for letting me share this piece of my family and my brother with you. Thank you for listening.